It is September 16th, 2003. My name is Leo Perry. From 1987 through December of 1993, I was the historian for the town of Schuyler Falls. During that time, I took approximately 1,000 photographs and rephotographed many others from pictures that I had borrowed from people. I also assembled nearly 500 slides. These slides and photographs were all made with my own funds at no charge to the town. But at this time, I am donating my slides to the town under the guidance of present historian Mr. Marvin Connor. I will narrate these slides starting with tray number 1 through tray number 4. And as I do this, I will explain to the best of my ability what each slide represents. At this time, I will start doing this. Slide number 1, tray number 1. The building that you see in the foreground was originally built by Charles Broadwell, who at one time had a starch factory diagonally across the street from there on the riverbank. For many years, Mr. Broadwell lived there, and then later the house became the owner of Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor was a very prominent man. He was a son of Mr. Jared Taylor, who was one of the early settlers in Morrisonville, and he owned some of the mills across the street from where he lived. In fact, they are visible on the left side of the picture as you're looking down through there. There would have been a starch factory, not one owned by Mr. Broadwell, a different one, and then there was a grist mill, then there was a butter factory, and a woolen mill, in that order. Now, the house that Mr. Taylor had, his name was Albert Taylor. This brick house was torn down about 1961, when at that time the state of New York decided to redo this Route 22B coming through Morrisonville going towards Schuyler Falls and Peru. In so doing, they tore this house down. The last owner to live in that house were Howard and Rose Stone. It was a shame to tear that house down. It had so many nice hardwood fixtures in it. As you went in the front door, and I will explain this later as we come to another slide showing this picture, or this house, from the front. Now go to number 2. This is a look of the street going down through by the starch factory on the left, the grist mill, the butter factory, and the woolen mill. And if you'll notice, there were still wooden sidewalks as well as the dirt streets. Now, the White House by the big elm tree on the right was later owned by Mr. John Conroy, Sr. He was the father of Arnold Conroy, grandfather of John Conroy, who still lives in Morrisonville in 2003. That later became the butter factory when the one across the street had closed. And the reason that became the butter factory was that Mr. Conroy had been in charge of the butter factory before its closing. The building on the right, the one where there is a nick in the picture that you see where the wood sidewalk leads, was a store. And they were sort of a general store, and later that was jacked up and moved down the street and around the corner up on Maple Street. It would be as Maple Street going from Main Street going south. As Maple Street makes the sharp turn to the left, that would be the house that is presently there on the left-hand corner of the street. Here's another view of Morrisonville showing pretty much the same as you saw previously. Now, As you're looking down the street, very faintly you can see the steeple of the present Methodist Church and the Baptist Church, which is across the bridge into the town of Plattsburgh. And that Baptist Church is now owned by Dick Crawford, who turned it into apartment. Now, on the very right-hand side of the picture is the old Catholic church before it had a steeple on it. The steeple was not installed until somewhere between 1898 and 1902. There's a close-up picture of what I was detailing, where you see the Methodist church in the foreground and the Baptist church a little farther down the street. I recall, as you're looking at the big elm tree in the front of the picture, I recall when there was a man by the name of McMartin. His name was Jim McMartin. Used to live in that white house, and he had a pretty vicious German shepherd, and he used to chain him to that tree. And believe me, when we went up the sidewalk, when later on when I was a kid and there was a cement sidewalk, we never ventured near the house or stayed on the sidewalk. We went across the street and walked up and bypassed where the dog was tied. This is the front of the Jacob Broadwell, later Albert Taylor, and later Howard and Rose Stone house. As I mentioned, the house never should have been torn down, because if you look at the entrance door, I remember going into that house many times, and that door was 3 inches thick, and it was an oak door. All the oak trim around the house was just beautiful, and as you opened the door, you came to the bottom of a stairway, the deck of a stairway, and on each side of the deck there were steps leading up to the deck, and then the stairway went to the second floor. Then when you got to the second floor, there was a great big beautiful railing going all around the opening. If you'll notice how the windows are in that house, they go nearly to the floor, the arch at the top. It was just an absolutely beautiful house. Now here's another view looking down through Morrisonville, and this, if you'll notice, had cement sidewalks. I don't know when this was taken, but that is the former White House that you saw in the previous picture that I explained, that was the last butter factory, as well as where the dog used to be tied. Now on the right you see the bigger building with a sort of a widow's watch at the top. That was the stable and horse carriage barn for Jared Taylor Sr. Jared Taylor, who was the father of Albert Taylor, and Jared was one of the owners of the mills across the street. Now, if you look right over the top of the first house, you'll see a chimney and a gable end of a house. That is the Jared Taylor house. That house is still there in Morrisonville, and it is owned by Herbert and Rita Farrell Sr. It is now a beautiful red house. You'll see it later in the slides. Now, looking down from the same vintage of where you saw the first slide, looking down onto the Jacob Broadwell house, this is what it looked like after the road was changed, and this was taken approximately 1987 or 88. And you'll notice all the mills on the left side of the river are now destroyed. There's another view looking from the hill down where the intersection on the left goes up to the Sand Road, and then it branches off again and goes to the Kents Falls Road. This is a picture that was taken out of Heard's history of Clinton and Franklin counties. This would be looking west on Main Street, The house on the left is now the red house that I described in one of the former or previous slides, and looking straight up the road on the left is the old Jacob Broadwell, later Taylor stone house. The building on the right was built after the woolen mill. The woolen mill is the higher building, and right after that was the grist mill and a butter factory and a starch factory. The building on the right was a forge, an iron forge, and I'm not sure whether the whole building became a forge or if only part of it, but later it was used for storing hides that were shipped away for various purposes. Also, the house on the left, that's the one that Jared Taylor lived in, and I will show you more of it later. Here is what you see there now. This is the corner of Main and Maple Street, where at the time this photo was taken was the town swimming pool in the Saranac River. Now this is Mr. and Mrs. Jared Taylor, and this was also a photo taken from the herd's history. That's the house that Mr. and Mrs. Taylor owned, and as a young fellow, young boy growing up in Morrisonville, right where the two young people on the porch is, where they are located, there is a step leading down to a wooden sidewalk that went to the street. And I remember that wooden sidewalk very well, though the Main Street sidewalk was cement at that time. Now over in the far left on the porch, you really can't distinguish it, but there is a water vat there. Water is run in from some springs in the back of that house, back to where there used to be a sawmill, and the water is very pure and clean, and it used to run into that vat, and then the overflow ran underground out under the highway out to the river. And there were many people that used to go there to get drinking water. Now this is what is there now. This is the former Jared Taylor house, now owned by Herb and Rita Farrell Sr. I believe that house was built somewhere around 1805. Now this is looking down Main Street, and if you'll notice, there is a paved highway, and I think that was put in 1922 because my wife's grandfather, Andy DeLorme, told me about working on that highway in the early 1920s. And if you'll notice, the car on the right would tell you that it is an early vintage, perhaps late teens or early 20s vehicle. Now the first building you see on the right is the former Herb Sorrell house. Herb Sorrell had a barber shop and pool room upstairs, and downstairs on the left side of the house his wife had a beauty parlor, and then the rest of the house they lived in the downstairs section. That house later burned. I believe it was about 1968 on a Sunday morning, rather cold, but in the spring. And I recall when that house burned down, it was quite a building, quite a fire. And the house right next door is still there, and the next house is still there as well. Where the Herb Sorrell house was is now a house located that was built by Edward and Annis Lamora. As far as I know, they are still living there. Now looking down Main Street, as it is today, or as it was about 1987, the house on the left, when I left Morrisonville in 1993, was owned by Campagnas. Before that, it was the Riley and Ruger store. And before that, it was the Will Myers store. And you will see picture or a slide of that further on into our collection. The house on the right that you see, the brown house, that is the corner of Main and Maple Street. That's where the original Clough Brothers store was, and later became the Riley and Ruger store. And when that burned, that's when they went across the street and bought the building from Mr. Will Myers. Now, Peter Daniels and his wife Betty built that brown house. I don't know who lives there now. The next house is, or was, the Davidson's house. And originally, back in the 1870s, it was the Thomas Sorrell Hotel. Now that is a closer look of the Riley and Ruger store and the Will Myers store. The store on the left was the Will Myers store, and you'll see a frontal view of that very shortly. The one on the right was the Clough Brothers store, and you will get a better idea as to what they had for stock. Now, looking down Main Street, you will notice how many nice, beautiful trees we used to have. And they were still there when the state highway was rebuilt in 1961, and they cut down nearly all of them. They really spoiled the looks of our nice little village. Now this is a color photo that I got from Mr. Roy Pierce. Here again we're looking at the same picture that you just saw, except in color. Now here's the front of the Clough Brothers store. Now Clough Brothers did not only run that store, they were also undertakers. And the second floor of the building was a community hall. The community would have dinners, they would have plays, they would have dances there, and it was a general civic center, so to speak. But if you look at the front of the store, and you'll see how the Clough Brothers sold Glenwood stoves, they had carpeting, they had dry goods. They were just all around entrepreneurs. It was said, and I don't know if this is factual, but when I used to have these historical meetings and some of the elder people in Morrisonville would come, they would give me a lot of information regarding these buildings. And it was told to me by a very reputable gentleman that the Clough Brothers left Morrisonville after it was found that they had been doing autopsies on people out in the backyard, not inside of the building. Whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, but I believe it might be. Now here's another picture looking from Maple Street toward Main Street. The large building on the right is the Clough Brothers store. The building straight ahead is the Will Myers store. And the smaller building on the right, just behind where these two gentlemen are sitting, was a blacksmith shop. And later it became a motorcycle repair place. Now here's another view of the Clough Brothers store. Okay, here's the corner that I spoke of before, where the Clough Brothers store used to be. I believe now it's an antique shop. And the building on the left is the Thomas Sorrell Hotel that I spoke of, and the small building on the right is what used to be the blacksmith shop and later the motorcycle shop. Now here's a front view of the Will Myers store. Now, if you have a magnifying glass, in the original photo, there's a little sign on the right, probably 4 feet off the porch, and that says post office. At that time, Mr. Leander Wood was the postmaster, and he remained postmaster until 1914 when Mr. Bill Light became postmaster, and he set up the post office in his general store across the bridge. And I will show you that farther on. The building on the right was the Carriage House and apparently other storage area, horse barn and carriage house. and that is located just about where John and Carol Sorrell's Red House is now located. If you will look on the second floor in the right-hand corner, there's a lady standing in the window. Now downstairs again, down on the front porch, between the last two gentlemen on the left, is a wooden washing machine. I have no idea just what year this is, but apparently it was before 1914 when Mr. Leander Wood retired. Here's another, maybe a little more clear picture of what I just described. And if you'll notice the stairway on the left with the roof on it, I believe that house that was rebuilt there still has that. This is the mill pond and it shows the Purdy sawmill across the river. This is the water that used to supply the power for the mills that I had mentioned before, the starch factories, the grist mill, butter factory, the woolen mill. And as I recall, as a young kid, we used to run up and down the sluice way, which was dry at that time because this mill pond had been destroyed, opened up, and the water had been let out. And we used to run up and down that sluice way playing hide and seek and all kinds of games that kids play. The sawmill, I don't know when it burned, but I am of the opinion, and from what I had talked to people, that it burned somewhere approximately 1935, or maybe even a little bit before that, 30 to 35. Here's another shot of it, and you'll see all the logs waiting to be sawed, and on the other side of the sawmill itself you'll see the piles of lumber that are there. It was a very busy place. They made lumber, they made siding, they made shingles there. And as a young kid again, my friends and I used to run along that side of the river and we'd play around the old foundations that were there. And here's another shot of it from downstream looking to the west. And if you'll see on the left, in the middle of the picture, you'll see the water coming over the dam. Right to the left, right directly to the left, you'll just see the edges of the old sluice way that I was telling you about, that we used to run up and down when we were kids. Now here's a postcard that I was given by Mr. Roy Pierce, and that shows the bridge that ran from Route 22B across the river to the sawmill. Some of those pilings were still there when I was a kid, but later on, as ice started moving down, they were destroyed. But in low water during the summer, low water, you can still see the very base of the old dam that went across there. In fact, right where we now have the historical markers with the 3 grinding wheels that it's set up there on the riverbank, you can look down there and see the remains of the old dam. And on the far side, you can see the high part of it. Here's a shot that was taken apparently from the top of the Sand Road Hill many years ago. I have no idea who took it, but you can just barely see in the kind of the right of center the sawmill. And here's another closer view, and this appears to be during the winter. Another photo that I got from Roy Pierce. This is what you see there, the high part of the dam on the far side where the sawmill was. This photo was taken in 1988 or 89. That's what it looks like in the summertime. Another shot in the winter. And then if you look right there at the left-hand side of the picture, there are some logs that apparently were driven in there many, many years ago when the sawmill was still running. And apparently this is where they would tie a log boom or chains to logs and anchor it to the far side of the river, the side where the highway is, and they would catch the logs coming downstream and channel them into a sluiceway that would bring them into the sawmill. And this is just another shot of the summertime. Now this is a picture of the former Dan Morrison House, and Mr. Morrison was one of the early settlers, and in Bird's history it tells how later in life he moved out of Morrisonville and went out west. Now this house is located as you're going up from Morrisonville on Route 22B. It's the large house on the right. I believe it's the second house on the right, and there is a historical marker out in front of it. And the people that you see in the picture, starting to the right, is Joseph Rabideau Jr., and on the left in the doorway is his brother Herbert Rabideau. The next gentleman in the middle with his hands on his hip was Mr. Joseph Rabideau Sr., who owned that house at that time, and then his wife, and then their children, their daughters. And the small one, the second daughter, is Mary Dashnaw. She was Raymond Red Dashnaw's wife, and she was the mother of Roland Dashnaw, Donald Dashnaw, and Doris Turbide. Now this is what the house looked like about 1988 or 89 when I took this. The new owner decided to take the asbestos shingles off the side of the house and discovered that it had nice spruce clapboards on it. So he redid it, took out some of the old windows, replaced it with the present windows that you see, and started painting it and did a lot of work on it. Now this is the view from the rear, and there is the old barn that you saw from the opposite side where the two Rabideau boys were standing. And here's another shot of the back. And if you'll notice on the end of the building where he has started taking off some of the asbestos shingles, the whole house was covered with that originally. Now here he is again doing some more trimming to fit these clapboards in place. This is the interior of the house. If you'll notice those planks running vertically, they are 3 inches thick. And in some cases, some of those are 22 inches wide. Now you can imagine the size tree that it took to be able to saw those planks and to make them into what they are. Now I'm not sure, but I believe if you look real close, you'll see that maybe there could be reciprocating sawmill marks on that, because the circular sawmill did not come into being until sometime after the Civil War time. So those logs were sawed apparently with a reciprocating saw. Here are some of the overlays, the ceiling rafters, so to speak. This was taken from out in the garage, but this is true throughout the house. Now here's the old hand pump that's in the back. It was in the back. I believe it's been removed and everything has been filled in so that no one could get hurt there. Now this is a blacksmith shop that was located down on Main Street. And if you recall the first pictures that you saw of the Broadwell house, and then there was the store, and then the Conroy house that was later the butter factory. This would have been to the west of that. That blacksmith shop was run by Mr. Henry Milo. Henry is the man on the left, The gentleman on the right is his son, Hubert Milo. And over in the right-hand door, you'll see a gentleman. His name was Henry. They called him Slim Henry. George was his name. He was a wheelwright. And in those days, wheelwrights and blacksmiths teamed up to do work together, because the wheelwright could build the wooden parts for the buggies and wagons as well as the wheels, but the blacksmith had to put the iron tire on it and do other iron work that went with the buggies and wagons. This is Hubert Milo later on in life when he had a blacksmith shop down in Plattsburgh. But look at the pile of horseshoes that he's got already in hand. This is a picture of the back part of the blacksmith shop where these guys were digging potatoes. I don't know who they are, but it was a photo that I was given by Roy Pierce again. Now this is another blacksmith shop, and there again, the man in the front is Mr. Henry Dagenau, and the gentleman in the front holding the horse's head is his son, Reynold Dagenau. That building was located on Emery Street, where the present KFC Hall is located. Now this inside of that same blacksmith shop, Mr. Henry Dagenau on the left, his son Reynold Dagenau in the middle, and George Henry on the right. Here again on a stump in front of that same blacksmith shop in the front is Mr. Henry Dagenau, his son Reynold on the left. In the back is the gentleman they used to call Pike Fisher, and on the right was Herb Robert. There again, this is the same shop with Mr. Henry Dagenau standing there and his son Reynold in the buggy. But if you look at that horse, you'd almost think it's ready for Saratoga races. This is the Oral Briette General Store and Feed Store. Oral Briette and Mr. Henry was Mr. Henry Dagenau's son-in-law, and they tore down the old blacksmith shop and built this store. And as you can see in the picture, that they're on the top of the picture, that was taken in 1946. Well, later on, in the early 80s, that the Knights of Columbus acquired the property, demolished the building and built their present building. This is another picture, and if you look at that Chevrolet car in the front, that is a 1946 Chevrolet. I remember those very well. Now here's the picture that tells you that it was Oral Briette and Son, and he sold at that time what is now Mobil Gas. At that time it was called Saucony or Mobil. Here's another view in the front, and on the right you will see the headlights to Mr. Briette's truck that he used to haul feed and coal with. Now this is a picture of the parking lot to the left of the KFC building, where the old blacksmith shop used to be. And you just barely see the KFC building on the right. The other white building in the back, I believe, is the one that used to be Mr. Oral Briette's house. This is the old house, or not the old house. At that time, that was the house that Mr. Henry Dagenau owned. And it is still there. It was right next door to what used to be the laundromat, which you can see on the right. And you'll see more pictures of that in the very near future. This is what that house looked like on Easter Sunday in 1934 when the river jammed up with ice and flooded everything. And you can see there are pretty good sized pieces of ice that are around there floating around. Here's another shot of it. Here it is, Easter Sunday 1934, and the laundromat, which was previously many other businesses I will describe later, is on the right. This is looking east on Easter Sunday 1934. That block that you see on the right near the lower right-hand corner, is right in front of the present Methodist Church. That's where the buggies used to drive up, and the ladies would get out of the buggies and step on that stepping stone and go down. You can see the bridge way down the middle of the picture. That is the old red bridge that we knew as kids. Now here's another shot of it. You see the force of the water looking, that's the intersection of Mason Street and Main Street. And the building on the left was the laundromat, but at that time it was it was Fred Briette's meat market. And in the back was Charlie Cook's barber shop and pool hall. And then it became Raleigh Trombley's IGA store. And then it became a bakery. Later it became a furniture stripping place. And then it became a laundromat. That building was built by Jack Broadwell approximately 1897. And this was related to me by his grandson, Andrew Broadwell. And the building on the right was Jack Broadwell's house. But after Jack Broadwell built this bigger building, he and Martin Harris became partners in the undertaking business. So there was an undertaking parlor upstairs and a furniture store downstairs. And if you'll notice out in the river how the ice is all piled up. And the big building on the right across the river is what later became the post office and general store of Bill Light and Amos Avery. And they also sold Model T cars at that time. And here's another view looking to the west on Main Street, and the first house where the cars are parked is where Roy Pierce used to live. Mr. Pierce gave me an awful lot of information, loaned me a lot of pictures, and I'm very indebted to him. That gentleman died about 1992 at 95 years old. This is a picture of what you just saw previously that was flooded. This was taken in 1989 or 90, when that was at that time the laundromat. It has since been torn down. I believe there's a car sales there now. This is the post office I was telling you about that Bill Light and Amos Avery had, and their general store and Model T Ford agency. That was a post office until about 1960s, when Mr. Light decided to retire. I think it was 1964, because he was postmaster for 50 years, so from 1914 to 1964. If you'll notice the Texaco gas pump out by the car. Now this is a picture of the interior of that store. That was taken approximately 1924, according to Roy Pierce. The gentleman on the left is Raymond Light. The one in the middle is William Light Jr. The next guy to the right is Roy Pierce, and the last man on the right was Francis Robert. This is what the building looks like today, or did look like about 1990 when I took this picture. And you'll see that there's the green bridge is there now where the red bridge was. Here's a shot taken of the later flood about mid-1980s. And the building on the left is what used to be the Martin Harris and Son Funeral Parlor, which was later taken over by O'Neill Red and Brown. And then it later became Checkout Store, Sugar Creek Checkout Store. This shows someone being carried out of the house where Robert and Dawn Langto now live. I will go on to this with the next tape. I mentioned that that flood was in the 80s. If you look at the lower left-hand corner, it will show a date. 22381. However, that building was originally built by Bernard Facto, who had a hardware store there for a number of years. And when the hardware store closed, Bernard moved to Florida, and someone else took it over, and they made a restaurant called the Royal Stag. And it was, I thought, a successful restaurant for a number of years, but for some reason the people closed it, and then it became a home. And this is a picture of the same flood taken from the south side of the bridge. And the house on the right is where, when I was living in Morrisonville, was owned by Colonel Wolfe. And there's another picture. This is looking down from to Main Street from Bushy Street. That may be Gerald Bushy walking down the roadway now. Here's an aerial view of that flood. Some backup of ice, isn't it? That would be looking west on Main Street. That looking east on Main Street. The square building on the right is what used to be the funeral home and the intersection of Mason Street. This is a picture of the original fire station in Morrisonville. The fire district was formed in 1928, and that's the original building right there. That's a drum and bugle corps that was formed by the fire department, and they played at many parades over the years. They were very popular. They were invited to play in a lot of places. The majorette in the middle, right between the bass drum and the stacked drums, at that time that was Teresa DeLorme. And now she is my wife, and she has put up with me now for almost 57 years. The house on the right is where my father-in-law used to own. And in 1954, when that fire station burned, February 8th, 1954, the side of his house that you see there caught fire as well. And it was lucky that we were able to save it, because the fire station caught fire sometime during the night, somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, I guess. And the guy living next door to the left of the picture, Ben Parent, was a volunteer fireman as well. And there's a button on the upper left-hand side of the main door, and that's what used to blow the siren for everybody to get summoned to the fire. Well, the fire had such a start that it burned those wires off. So in order to notify people, the lady that lives the second house from the fire station went up and down the road. Her name was Millie Chase. Went up and down the highway blowing her car horn, blowing it up and down the street, and got everybody out of bed so to see what was going on and see what they could do to help out. In the meantime, Benny opened those two big doors in the front with the idea of being able to go in and drive the one fire truck out. And the heat was too intense, and about the time that he got back to the door, the gas tank on that fire truck blew up. So he was very fortunate that he didn't make it to the truck. And with that fire, we did not save a single thing. Nothing was saved in that fire. We were fortunate that Clinton Prison loaned their fire truck for 2 days to us. And then in the meantime, a man that used to run a salvage yard, Joe Johnson, gave us the use of a big pump, a big one, that we mounted on the back of a truck owned by Leeward LaBarge. And we used that for a fire truck until we were able to get a new one ourselves. And it worked out pretty well. And with the mutual aid system that had already been installed in Clinton County, we were quite safe. But I'll tell you, when that fire station burned, we were certainly happy to see Katyville, Peru, and the city of Plattsburgh come and help us out. because in the meantime we had been throwing snow on my father-in-law's house, on Benny Parent's house, trying to use our well water to keep the fire down. We didn't have the village water system at that time. Here's another shot of the Drum and Bugle Corps. The first guy on the right, can't recognize him, but the majorette right there in the first one is my wife, Teresa, and the majorette on the left was Jane Ayres. And Jane Ayres is the wife of Dr. Harmon Lamar in Fort Kent. Here we are again, the Drum and Bugle Corps going down the Sun Parade. Here my wife on the left and Jane on the right. This is the, I can't tell which fire department, if that's Cadyville or Peru, putting water on the fire station. And that's the back of my father-in-law's house that you can see there on the left. They were pumping that water from the river with portable pumps. And probably by that time they might have been able to get one of their trucks down to the river, because there was a lot of snow, and I don't recall whether they did get a truck there or not. Here's another view of it, looking from the west side. It was a total disaster. There's the truck. Leeward LaBarge let us use that truck. Joe Johnson let us use the big pump and the tank. And that was our fire truck. And we answered calls through the time until we got ourselves a new truck. If you'll notice the end of that house on the left, that's Benny Parent's house. That was scorched so bad you can see how all the paint was scorched off the side of the house. He's the guy that tried to get in to drive the truck out. Here's what the fire station looks like today. And there was the Sugar Creek store. Previously to that, it was the funeral parlor. And at this time, it was Fred Pierce's general store. Fred Pierce was Roy Pierce's father. And if you'll notice, those are mules that are out there drawing the sleigh, and the guy on the sleigh is pretty well bundled up. Here's a picture of it in the summertime. The second man from the left in the front with his hands in his pocket is Fred Pierce. The guy standing in the doorway was Fred Trombley. He was the grandfather of Shirley LaBarge, great-grandfather of. Here's another close-up of that same picture that you saw in the winter. Here's what it looked like in 1961 when it was the Martin Harrison Son Funeral Home, and they are rebuilding the street. I had occasion quite a few times to help the Harrises out, sometimes especially after Mr. Harris Sr., Martin Harris, died. I used to quite often help Burdette Harris to go get corpse and help to get things ready for funerals. It would not be a vocation that I would wish to follow. In the background you can see the Methodist Church, and you can see the sign that said the Royal Stag Restaurant, the building in between. This is the checkout store. This is the house that Roy Pierce was born in, and that was his mother and his two sisters sitting there. And if you'll notice, there were still the plank sidewalks in the village at that time. This is another closer look, and that is Roy Pierce on the left, his sister Catherine, and his other sister Ethel. Catherine never married, Roy never married, and Ethel married a man by the name of Dustin, Harry Dustin, who worked at the Morrisonville Railroad Station. Later they moved to Watertown, I believe, and that's Mrs. Pierce sitting there with them. Here's Roy's mother, Mrs. Pierce, and the lady on the left, I believe, is my wife's great-grandmother, Mrs. LaRock. Here's a picture of the house, and if you'll notice, the roof is shoveled off. The porch roof, the snow is shoveled off. Well, I happened to be driving by, and Roy Pierce, who at that time I think was 92 years old, was up there just shoveling that roof off. So I enticed him to come down and let me finish shoveling it. Much to his dismay, he did not want to come off the roof, but I thought at 92 years old he should be on the ground. This is Roy Pierce's mother when she was a young girl of about 15, who brought her horse down to be shod at one of the local blacksmith shops, and Roy was never able to determine which blacksmith shop it was, so that'll be something that'll remain a mystery, I guess. This is the Fred Trombley store. If you'll remember in one of the photos of the Fred Pierce store, Fred Trombley was the gentleman standing in the middle in front of the door. Mr. Fred Trombley had that store on the corner of Mason and River Street. It later became the Henry Lux Store. And then when the Lux closed the store, I guess it just became a living quarters. Mrs. Luck, who was Mabel, was one of Fred Trombley's daughters. This is a picture of the Sutherland Store. That is the intersection of Church Street and Emery Street. The foundation of that store is still there, visible near the garage of the yellow house that is across from the Catholic Church. And the house on the left is still there, however it is now a white house. Here's a picture of what it looked like about 1990 when I took this picture. And there's a pile of wood where the old store foundation used to be. That maple tree in the middle is one of the most colorful pictures that you can look at when the leaves are changing in the fall of the year. And I have taken several photos of it, and I brought it to Florida with me just so I could remember how beautiful the North Country could be. This is the house that I was telling you about. Mrs. LaRock, who was my wife's great-grandmother, lived next door. And there again, I made a mistake. It was not Mrs. LaRock, it was Mrs. Peter DeLorme, who was the lady with the black dress standing on the wood platform. The boy standing to the right was my father-in-law when he was about 14 years old. The lady sitting down in the middle is his grandmother, LaRock, who was the mother of his mother, who was sitting on the right, Annie DeLorme. So on the right, Annie DeLorme, Mrs. LaRock, my father-in-law, and Mrs. DeLorme. I was present when that house burned one winter. Very fierce fire, but we were able to save the houses both sides. There again, we did not have village water, therefore no hydrants. We had to depend on pumping from the river. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Richard Emery. They owned the house that Oral Gagnon owns now, and you will see some similarities when you see pictures of both of them at that time and the later day. And of course they own the area where the post office presently is. In fact, they own much of the middle of Morrisonville at one time. Mr. Emery, he built ladders, and his ladders became quite famous, and he had a kind of a large area, I guess even into the Midwest, selling ladders. But he also had a general store there. He had a skunk farm. He had an apple orchard. and a funeral parlor. And Roy Pierce told me one time that Mr. Emery was a very mean sort of a man. Roy gave me an indication that there was one time when Mr. Emery had a horse that refused to move. It was just a balky horse and wouldn't move. And I guess Mr. Emery tried everything to get him to move and nothing happened, till finally Roy Pierce told me he saw this happen, that Mr. Emery reached down and grabbed a handful of dirt and just packed it into the horse's ear. Now, that was definitely animal cruelty, and I can't imagine anyone being that miserable. This is the house that was there when the Emerys owned it. And if you'll notice, there's some very good similarities. Some of the decorations are taken off it, but that's where Oral Gagnon lived. And the building on the right is where Emery's had his store. And you'll notice the various trees there for his apple orchard. I don't know, his skunk farm apparently was farther in the back. This is across the street from Oral Gagnon's house. This is the house on the left, the first white one, when I was living in Morrisonville, belonged to the Fagans. I don't know who lived there now. The next house was a house that was owned by the Bateses. I believe Mr. Bates was a Civil War veteran. The next house on the right that you see is the one that I showed you where my father-in-law and his grandmothers and his mother were sitting. At the time that that house burned, it was owned by Rocks. There's a picture of the same area, the house that the Fagans owned, the Bateses, and then the next building is where the Rock House burned and now owned by LaBarges, looking east toward the bridge. This is Clifford Ayers. He owned the garage where the post office now stands, and Mr. Ayers ran that garage, and he was also the last lamp lighter in the village of Morrisonville. And Mr. Pierce gave me a lamp globe off the old street lamps that Mr. Ayers used to light every night. That globe is now in possession of my son Patrick Perry, who now has it. That is Dr. Dare, Gilbert Dare, who was a physician during World War I. He was in Europe, and there are several newspaper articles about him. And I remember Dr. Dare as a young man. His father owned the house where Roger and Genevieve Everlith now live, and he also kept a horse up on Mason Street, and you can see that's the silo in the background. And I'm not sure where it was, but that was on Mason Street somewhere. Later, Dr. Dare set up practice in Plattsburgh and lived there until he retired. This is the corner of Emery and Main Street. The building on the left was the Grange Hall, and that was our basketball court during the times that I was in high school. It was our community center after the old Riley and Ruger Hall burned. The building on the right was the originally Francis Robert bar room on one side, and I guess ice cream parlor on the other. And later Red Dagenau bought this building and had a store there, and it went on to his son Roland, who later had the post office in the left-hand part of the building. Then it became a liquor store on one side and an appliance store on the right. Later, a bakery. The car on the left appears to be a car like my father-in-law had, a 1931 Dodge. But I have many good memories of that Grange Hall. The principal would let us out of school, let two of us out of school about 20 minutes early, so that we could go down and build fires in the two big wood furnaces that were there. And believe me, it was ungodly cold sometime. And we'd get these fires going, and that would smoke up the inside of the place. But nevertheless, we had a lot of fun playing basketball there. We could not play any league games there because the place was not big enough. At the far end of the building there was a stage, and our basketball basket was right there. The top of the backboard was against the ceiling, and on this front end where you see the steps, there were some swinging doors, and we used to prop those open. And so we'd come in for a layup shot. We wouldn't hit the doors, but occasionally with enough vibration of playing, running up and down, one of those doors would come loose, swinging itself into the gym area. And believe me, you took a lot of caution when you saw that happening. We had no running water in there. We had only an old hand pump down in the basement. And we would get all sweat, go down there and get a drink of water, and as your buddy would come along, you somehow or other cupped the cup, your hands full of cold water, and just dashed it on him just to wake him up a little bit. This is Mr. Roy Dara. He was a man who owned the building right there over the horse's head that was called the Union House. And it was a bar room and kind of a hotel. And that was located diagonally across the street from the what is now Bill's Mini Mart. Now, though this is in the town of Plattsburgh, some of these slides are of the town of Plattsburgh because the village was into both townships, so they had so much in common. There is a Gibbered Hotel. That was immediately to the right of the building that I just showed you. And I've got a little story about that. In 1906, there was a lady that I used to interview, and you'll see her further near the end of these slides. Her name was Tessie Kamesh, and in 1906 she worked at that hotel. But she left to go to Troy, New York to get married. Well, she told me later on, as I was interviewing her, she said, you know, my husband was a handsome young man, and the girls wouldn't leave him alone. And she says, I put up with it for about 3 years, and finally one night when he came home, I sat him down at the kitchen table, and I said, you know, I'm married to you, you're married to me, and you are supposed to come home with me at night. And she says, apparently you don't want to be married, so at this time I'm going to leave you. So she said, I gave him $10 and I left. And that was the end of the divorce proceedings. And I will tell you more about Tessie as we go along. This is a board called at that time a board that for the armed people who served in the armed forces during World War II. As someone was taken into the service, they enlisted or they were drafted, their name was put on the bulletin board. And those that did not make it back, there was a gold star put at the end of their name. And this bulletin board, all the little communities had these boards. And the people in the front, on the left, was Doris Bouillet. The one in the middle was Janice Sorrell. The one on the right was Teresa Delorme, who is now my wife. That bulletin board, after the The war was over several years after. In fact, only about 2 years after, was taken down, and it was stored in what was later the town garage, which was originally the woolen mill that you saw in first slides. And that burned when the town garage burned. These are two gentlemen, Bert Sorrell on the right, who is the father of Lloyd Sorrell, and the guy on the left is Joe Bouye, and they are out on a Sunday morning having a drink of water from the old hand pump. There are a lot of stories about how they sometimes had Mr. Bouye and Mr. Sorrell used to make home brew, and they used to say, well, my batch is better than yours, come on over and check mine. This is a picture of a house that is now burned, but is on Mason Street, first house on the right, going across the railroad crossing. What was the railroad crossing? It was last owned by Emmett Buckley, and it was owned by Roy Pierce's grandfather, Mr. Peter, I can't think of his last name. If I can remember it, I'll come back to it. But anyhow, this was owned by him. This picture here will show you Roy's grandfather with a horse. Now you look at the size of that horse and the opening for that garage door. That horse really had to duck to go in there. He was a huge horse. This is Mr. and Mrs. Levi Sorrell. Their house is the first house to the north of the present town offices. Mr. and Mrs. Sorrell were my wife's grandmother, her mother's grandmother and grandfather. But the reason I was also showing you this slide is that if you'll notice the car across the street, that was a, I believe, 1938 or 39 Chrysler Airflow vehicle. It pretty much looked the same from the front as it did from the back. It was a very strange vehicle when it first came out. It didn't stay on the market long. They went to different designs after. This is a racehorse and sulky, and the man in the sulky was Mr. George Seymour, and he is Robert Bud Seymour's father. He used to exercise those horses, and I don't remember who owned them, but I think the Broadwells used to raise some of those horses. This is a baseball team. I don't know where the location is. Roy Pierce, who gave me this picture, didn't know where it was located. But the gentleman sitting in the front, the heavy gentleman with his hand on the bat boy's shoulder, was Herb Sorrell. And I told you about his house and pool room in one of the earlier slides. And I knew Mr. Sorrell very well when I was growing up, and later on next door I lived, my wife and I and kids lived in the house right next door to them, the small house that is still there, right next door to where the Lamores now live. Now, Mr. Sorrell had a temper that was faster than lightning. If something went wrong, immediately, there was no question about what was going to happen. He just blew his stack. And Mr. Sorrell used to be a catcher on that baseball team. And Roy Pierce used to tell me, and in fact, Mr. Sorrell told me himself, he said, when I made an error, I would take off my catcher's mitt, I would take off my mask and chest protector and catch behind the plate that way. And if you saw his knuckles, you would understand what happened when he caught that way. But he was a very rugged gentleman. But when it came to being a neighbor, you could not ask for a better neighbor, and a nice gentleman. Herb Sorrell was the first fire chief in the Morrisonville Fire Department. He and his wife Eva lived next door to us, and anytime our children were outside, they always had an apple or cookies or something for them. The guy, not the guy standing there with his hands down, but the first man sitting down on the bench was Fred Briette, who ran a meat market down to where the laundromat later came. And then Fred Briette bought a store in Dannemora from L.H. Buck and had a meat market and general store there for many, many years until his son Donald and son Ting took it over. It has since burned, and I'm not sure what, I guess Ting's restaurant is there now. The rest of the people in that picture, Roy Pierce did not recognize. This is a monument that is down in front of the fire station that was dedicated, and I don't see a date on it. That happened after I moved here to Florida after 1993. It is placed in front of a World War II monument that was constructed there in 1947. I don't know why they couldn't have been put side by side instead of one hiding the other, but anyhow, that's the way it is. And right behind it is the stone that I was just talking about. That was dedicated in 1947. My father-in-law was the one that started the movement to get this stone installed in honor of those who lost their lives in World War II. And you will notice right there on the stone the number of people who lost their lives from our little township. This is the day of the dedication. This is Donald Rabideau, who is unveiling the flag, taking the flag off the monument. And Donald was the son of Alfred Rabideau, who lost his life during World War II and whose name is inscribed down there. Just to the right side of Donald Rabideau is my father-in-law, Nelson DeLorme, who got this thing going and done with. And right next to him is Leonard Gadway, who at that time was the supervisor of our town. And right behind Donald, the gentleman who is partially visible, was Jim Fitzpatrick, who at that time was our state assemblyman. And right next to him was Reverend Green from the Methodist Church, and to Reverend Green's right, the first man on the left, was Monsignor Gobey from the Catholic Church. That's the monument that's up in front of the Catholic Church rectory. I've just been informed that the rectory is going to be demolished. I don't know for sure what's going to happen with the monument, but I believe there's going to be another one indicating that that's where the rectory was and perhaps will be installed near that present monument. This is a monument in honor of the 3 young men from our township who lost their lives in Vietnam. And this was dedicated down at the KFC home. It's still there with 2 flagpoles in the front, and it's sad to believe that such a small community had to lose 3 young gentlemen in their prime of life. This is the Morrisonville Ambulance. There again, this is located on the Banker Road on the town of Plattsburgh side of the river. However, the ambulance group was started by Donald Dashnaw, who lived across the street from the KFC home. Donald started this group. People including Donald, went out and took courses. Other people joined the group, took courses, and eventually they got permission to add to the taxes every year a certain amount of money for the ambulance group. Well, I was up there this year, 2003, took pictures of what's there now. It doesn't look at all like what it is here. They've really expanded it, and Donald is to be commended, even though he now lives in North Charleston, South Carolina. He's to be commended for so-called taking the bull by the horns and heading this project and seeing it through its completion. This is a picture of Dewitt Clinton Broadwell. Mr. Broadwell came from New Jersey sometime in the early 1800s, and he built a log house on Mason Street. It was located approximately 100 feet to the north of where the red brick house is located, at the intersection of the Broadwell Road and Mason Street. And then later, Mr. Broadwell built the house across the street, the beautiful stone house, and it went down through several generations, where now it's down to Keith Broadwell Jr. is now the owner. It's a beautiful structure. It's shown in the herd's history, and it's great to see it where it is still in existence. This is a picture of where the dam used to be on the little brook just to the south of the Broadwell house. David Broadwell, one of Mr. Dewitt Clinton Broadwell's sons, built a sawmill there, and it was a reciprocating sawmill. And also to the south of the Broadwell house, Mr. Broadwell had a blacksmith shop. There's the Broadwell buildings as they are today. That is the picture of the Broadwell house. There it is looking at it from the south side. The blacksmith shop would have been in the near section of the picture, right near the brook. This is the Broadwell Cemetery. And I got permission from Mr. Keith Broadwell to get a group of inmates from Dannemora to come down and clean out all of the woods and get it cleaned up somewhat. And it is now being looked after pretty well by the present historian Marvin Connor, and I want to commend him on his work going to do all of the cemeteries that he's working on. This is a wooden box that David Broadwell had, and it was passed down through generations to Andrew Broadwell, who was a teacher in Cadyville High School and then later in Champlain Rouse's Point area. And Mr. Broadwell came to a couple of our meetings, and he brought that box. And that box is lined, you'll see the cover in a minute, it's lined with a newspaper saying that it is the Broadwell newspaper. You see it right there? Broadwell Plattsburgh Republican. And that's what the inside of that box looked like. So I don't know just how old it is, but certainly it is way, way over 100 years old. There's a close-up of it, and that says, I think, I'm not sure what the date up there is. You would need a magnifying glass, but July 27th, 18-something, 30 or 87. This is my friend Tessie Kamesh. She was the daughter of Henry Milo the blacksmith. Tessie was quite a lady, and I think the best way to describe Tessie, to tell you, is that she was just full of all kinds of vigor. Here she is at 98 years old, hoeing in her garden. That's the first time I got to see her for interviews. I used to know her as a young kid, and I had not seen her in at least 15 years. So when I went up and I said to her, "Hi, I don't know if you remember me or not." And right away she said, "Yeah, you're the little Perry boy from down in the village." Well, the little Perry boy at that time weighed around 210 pounds and 6 feet tall. But anyhow, we had a nice conversation, and she was telling me about her exercises, and she's showing me that she does this every morning when she gets up. She reaches down, touches her toes, and does various other exercises. And she did this once without me realizing that she was going to do it. So when she stood up, I said, "Gee, I wish I'd have known you were going to do that. I would have liked to have taken your picture. Do you think you could do it again for me?" And she said, "Well, of course I can." And she bent down in the position that you see, and she said to me, "You tell me when you want me to straighten up." So that was the kind of a gal she was, a very, very nice lady to interview. And she is showing me some ribbons that she won at the county fair for her canned goods. And she was just a very vibrant woman. You will see more of her later. Well, here it is right here. This is on her 100th birthday. She was born 1888 on Christmas Day, and this is her birthday in the Catholic Church. Tessie was holding a little trophy that I had made for her, signifying that she was 100 years old.